On the central coast of Vietnam, half swallowed by jungle and rice paddy, brick towers rise out of the earth like something that refuses to be forgotten. Locals call them the Towers of the Cham. For centuries, outsiders walked past them assuming they were relics of a people long extinct, ghosts of a lost civilization, wiped off the map by war and time. But the Cham were never gone. Millions of their descendants are alive today, scattered across Vietnam, Cambodia, and diaspora communities as far as Malaysia and France. And when geneticists finally sat down to test their DNA, not their pottery, not their inscriptions, not their crumbling temples, but their actual living genomes, the results didn't just confirm what history books said, they contradicted it. Because the story the temples told was one of a mighty seafaring kingdom, Hindu-influenced, Sanskrit writing, ruling the coast of Vietnam for over 1,000 years. But the story hidden inside Cham chromosomes was a story of migration across an entire ocean, of ancient farmers island-hopping thousands of kilometers before anyone had a name for Vietnam at all. It was a story where the foreign conquerors of Southeast Asia turned out to share ancestry with the people of Taiwan, Borneo, and even Madagascar. Today, we're tracing exactly how that discovery happened, and why it forces us to redraw the map of who really settled Southeast Asia. To understand why the DNA results shocked historians, you first have to understand who the Cham were supposed to be. From roughly the 2nd century CE to the 17th century, the Kingdom of Champa controlled a long stretch of what is now central and southern Vietnam. It wasn't a single unified empire in the way we imagine Rome or China. It was a network of competing principalities, port cities, and river valleys, loosely bound by shared language, shared religion, and shared trade routes. Champa absorbed Indian religious and political ideas early: Hindu temple architecture, Sanskrit royal inscriptions, and later, waves of Islamic influence that transformed much of the population into what we now call the Bani Cham and Cham Muslims. Historians studying Champa through texts alone had one big problem. Nearly all the surviving written sources came from outsiders. Chinese court chronicles described the Cham as pirates and raiders. Vietnamese chronicles described them as a rival kingdom to be conquered. And eventually, largely, they were. By the late Lê dynasty's southward expansion, a process the Vietnamese call Nam Tien, Champa's territory was absorbed piece by piece into what is now Vietnam. Its cities were sacked, its royal lines fractured, its remaining population survived in shrinking enclaves. For a long time, the assumption in linguistics, later reinforced in genetics, was that the Cham were Austronesian in the same sense that Malays, Filipinos, or Polynesians are Austronesian. Their language belonged to the Malayo-Polynesian branch of the Austronesian family, a language family whose roots trace back to Taiwan roughly 5,000 years ago. That single fact was strange enough on its own. A kingdom sitting on the Southeast Asian mainland, surrounded by Mon Khmer and Vedic-speaking neighbors, was speaking a language whose closest relatives were on islands hundreds of kilometers away. Linguists like Robert Blust had mapped this Austronesian language tree in detail for decades, but language doesn't always equal ancestry. People can adopt a new language through trade, conquest, or intermarriage without any genetic exchange at all. So a question lingered for generations. Were the Cham genetically Austronesian too, descendants of seafaring migrants who settled on the mainland? Or were they a mainland population that simply picked up an island language through contact and trade? Only DNA could answer that. Getting Cham DNA wasn't as simple as swabbing a cheek. For decades, Southeast Asian population genetics lagged far behind studies of Europe or East Asia, for reasons that had nothing to do with scientific interest and everything to do with access, funding, and history. Vietnam's long 20th century, colonial rule, then decades of war, made large-scale genetic sampling logistically difficult and politically sensitive. The Cham themselves, as a minority community with a complicated relationship to the Vietnamese state, were understandably cautious about outside researchers showing up to collect blood samples. Trust had to be built, often through local universities and community leaders, before any swab was taken. It wasn't until population geneticists working across mainland Southeast Asia, researchers like Wibhu Kutanen, who has spent years building a genomic map of the region's ethnic groups from Thailand to Vietnam, began systematically sequencing mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome markers, and eventually genome-wide SNP data from dozens of minority populations, that the Cham finally got proper genetic attention. Their samples were folded into broader surveys of Vietnam's more than 50 recognized ethnic groups, comparing Cham genomes against Kin Vietnamese, Khmer, Idi, Jarai, and various highland groups. What made the Cham data particularly valuable was the built-in comparison group sitting right next door, the Edi and Jarai peoples of Vietnam's Central Highlands. Both groups also speak Austronesian Malayo-Polynesian languages, meaning three culturally and geographically distinct populations: coastal, historically Hindu-Buddhist, then Muslim Cham; highland, animist Ede; highland, animist Jarai. All shared linguistic ancestry despite living completely different lives for over 1,000 years. If genetics showed all three sharing a deep common ancestral signal, that would settle the debate the linguists couldn't close alone. The first wave of results came from uniparental markers, the Y chromosome, passed from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, passed from mother to child. These are blunter tools than full genome sequencing, but they're excellent at tracing deep migration routes because they don't recombine. They carry a clean, unbroken thread back through generations. The mitochondrial data on Cham populations revealed a set of haplogroups, genetic lineages defined by shared mutations, that matched patterns found across island Southeast Asia. Lineages associated with the ancient Austronesian expansion out of Taiwan, the same broad family found in Indonesian, Filipino, and Malagasy populations. This was the first hard genetic confirmation that the linguistic connection wasn't just cultural mimicry. Somewhere in the deep past, real people carrying real Austronesian maternal lineages had settled on the Vietnamese coast and left descendants who, more than 1,000 years later, still carried the signal. The Y chromosome data complicated the picture in an interesting way. Alongside Austronesian-associated paternal lineages, researchers found substantial contributions from lineages common in Mon Khmer-speaking mainland populations, the same broad ancestral pool contributing to Khmer, Vietnamese, and various highland groups. In other words, the Cham weren't a population that arrived by boat and stayed genetically isolated for 2,000 years. They were a population shaped by continuous mixing with their mainland neighbors, even while their language and much of their maternal ancestry held onto the Austronesian signal. This detail matters enormously, and it's the first place where the DNA results start pushing back against the simplest version of the seafaring conquerors narrative. The Cham weren't foreign colonizers who never touched the local population. They were a hybrid population from very early on, likely from the first generations of contact between incoming Austronesian speakers and existing mainland communities, who had already been living along that coast for thousands of years before any Austronesian voyager ever landed. Archaeological and linguistic models had long proposed a rough timeline. Austronesian speakers left Taiwan around 3000 BCE, spread through the Philippines and Indonesia over the following 2 millennia, with a branch eventually reaching the Southeast Asian mainland coast sometime between 500 BCE and the early centuries CE, arriving right around the time the earliest Cham polities start appearing in the historical and archaeological record. Genome-wide data, layered on top of the uniparental results, let researchers estimate admixture timing more precisely using statistical methods that measure how chunked or broken up shared ancestral segments are. Segments that haven't been broken up much by generations of recombination point to a more recent mixing event. Heavily fragmented segments point to something older. The admixture dates that came out of Cham genomes lined up strikingly well with the archaeological horizon for early Huỳnh culture, the Iron Age culture of central Vietnam that most archaeologists consider the direct material precursor to the Cham kingdoms. Huỳnh sites are famous for elaborate jar burials, glass and carnelian beadwork connected to trade networks stretching to India, and pottery styles that show clear influence from island Southeast Asia. That overlap was the moment several papers explicitly connected. The DNA's admixture clock and the archaeological dates for Huỳnh essentially confirmed the same event from 2 completely independent lines of evidence. Population geneticists and archaeologists rarely get to say that so cleanly. Here's where the story stops just confirming old theories and starts overturning them. Once genome-wide comparisons expanded to include populations further afield, Indonesian groups, Philippine groups, and crucially, the Malagasy people of Madagascar, an island off the coast of East Africa, over 6,000 kilometers from Vietnam, the Cham genetic signal placed them inside a much larger and much older story than one kingdom on one coast. The Malagasy people are famously, almost bizarrely, closely related to populations in Borneo, particularly the Maanyan people of southern Kalimantan, a connection first proposed on purely linguistic grounds and later spectacularly confirmed by genetics. Malagasy genomes carry a clear Southeast Asian genetic signature dating to a migration across the entire Indian Ocean roughly 1,200 to 1,300 years ago. When Cham genetic data is placed on the same broad Austronesian family tree, it sits as a branch that split off much earlier than the branch leading to Madagascar, but from the very same root system, the same expansion event out of Taiwan that eventually sent some descendants west across an ocean to Africa, and others west along the mainland coast to Vietnam. Think about the scale of what that means. A single ancestral population, likely numbering only in the thousands, generated genetic descendants who would eventually leave their mark from the shores of Taiwan, across the entire Indonesian archipelago, up into mainland Vietnam building brick temple cities, and all the way across open ocean to a continent most of them never even knew existed. The Cham weren't a strange, isolated outlier. They were one branch of what may be the single most geographically explosive population expansion in human history before the modern era. Bigger in raw distance covered than the Bantu expansion, bigger than the Indo-European spread, executed largely by people in outrigger canoes. This is the part of the DNA story that quietly demolishes an old academic assumption, that Southeast Asian civilization moved in one direction only, from India and China outward, radiating influence onto passive local populations. The Cham data flips that. The people who built Champa's temples weren't simply a mainland population borrowing Indian religious ideas wholesale. Their ancestors were themselves migrants, part of a maritime, ocean-crossing culture, whose reach rivaled or exceeded the reach of the land empires around them. There's a modern twist that genetic studies had to reckon with directly. Today's Cham population is split largely into two groups: the Cham Balamon, who retain elements of the older Hindu-influenced religious tradition, and the Bani Cham and Cham Islam, who follow forms of Islam that arrived through trade contact with Malay and other Muslim merchant communities, especially from the 15th century onward, as Champa's political power collapsed and communities scattered, some migrating into Khmer territory in what is now Cambodia. A natural question for geneticists was whether religious conversion also meant significant new genetic input. Did the shift to Islam come with a wave of Arab, Persian, or Indian Muslim merchant ancestry mixing into the population, the way it did in parts of coastal Indonesia and Malaysia? The genome-wide data gave a fairly clear answer: not much, at least not at a scale visible in the broad ancestry proportions. The Cham Bani and Cham Islam populations remain genetically extremely close to the Cham Balamon population. Religious change here appears to have moved largely through cultural transmission, trade contact, intermarriage with existing local Muslim networks, and political alliance, rather than through a demographically significant migration event, replacing or diluting the existing gene pool. In plain terms, the Cham didn't need an influx of new ancestry to become Muslim. They converted much the way populations across history have converted, through belief, trade, and social networks, while their underlying ancestry, the same deep Austronesian plus mainland mixture, forged over 1,000 years earlier, stayed remarkably intact. This finding matters because it pushes back against a lazy assumption sometimes made about Islam's spread in Southeast Asia, that conversion always tracked with new foreign bloodlines replacing local populations. The Cham data says otherwise. Culture and genes don't have to move together, and in this case, they clearly didn't. The genetic record also captures something historians had documented in outline but never in this kind of granular detail: what happened demographically after Champa's political collapse. As Vietnamese control expanded southward over centuries, absorbing former Cham territory, populations didn't simply vanish or stay perfectly separate. Intermarriage, displacement, and cultural absorption reshaped the region's gene pool in measurable ways. Some kin Vietnamese populations in the historically Cham-controlled central and southern regions carry small but detectable traces of Cham-associated ancestry, a genetic footprint of centuries of coexistence, conflict, and eventual merging that predates and follows the kingdom's fall. Meanwhile, the Cham communities that survived as distinct groups, largely in Ninh Thuan and Binh Thuan provinces, plus the diaspora that resettled in Cambodia, retained a genetic profile close to their pre-conquest ancestors, suggesting these communities functioned as relatively bounded, self-marrying populations for much of the last few centuries, a pattern consistent with a minority group preserving identity under political pressure. That combination, subtle Cham ancestry appearing in the broader Vietnamese population, while Cham communities themselves stayed genetically distinct, is a textbook genetic signature of what historians call a core and periphery survival pattern. The politically dominant group absorbs a little of everything. The surviving minority holds onto its own lineage tightly, often as an unconscious side effect of social and religious boundary keeping, rather than any deliberate genetic strategy. Step back from the specific haplogroups and admixture dates, and the Cham story becomes something much bigger than one Southeast Asian kingdom. It's a case study in how DNA can correct the historical record when written sources are incomplete, biased, or written entirely by outsiders and conquerors. Nearly everything we knew about the Cham for centuries came from the people who fought them: Chinese, Vietnamese, later French colonial scholars. Genetics gave the Cham a kind of testimony that doesn't depend on who was holding the pen. Their chromosomes carried a receipt for a journey no conqueror's chronicle bothered to record. A multi-thousand-kilometer maritime migration that connected a temple-building kingdom on the Vietnamese coast to the outrigger canoes of ancient Taiwan and, improbably, to the highlands of Madagascar. It also complicates any simple story of invader versus native in Southeast Asian history. The Cham were both descendants of seafaring newcomers and centuries of continuous mixing with the mainland populations already there before them. Their genome is a fusion, not a foreign implant, and definitely not a clean island culture that stayed pure and separate on the mainland for 2,000 years. And finally, it's a reminder that populations we now think of as small minorities, a few 100,000 Cham speakers today, a fraction of Vietnam's population, can carry genetic testimony to a history far larger than their current numbers suggest. The Cham aren't a footnote to Vietnamese history. Their DNA places them at the center of one of the greatest ocean-crossing human migrations that ever happened, one that reshaped the human map from Taiwan to Africa, with a kingdom of brick towers on the Vietnamese coast as one of its most enduring and most misunderstood chapters. The towers are still standing. Now, so is the truth about who built them.